we work for governments, but our remit is actually to really bridge between the research world and policy making, so that we have a mission. And so we have a more, I would say, future-oriented, forward-looking mission compared to some of the other bodies of the organization. So we have a lot of different projects. So we have work on educational research, we have work on 21st century children, we have work on how to foster and assess creativity and critical thinking, so how you shift from a regular curriculum to a more competency-based curriculum. We have work on the measurement of innovation in education, or on teachers, and so we have a really broad variety of work. And I would say the common thread is really that either we study specific innovations, or we try to anticipate and put things on the policy agenda by looking at the weak signals and trying to anticipate what are the new policy issues which are coming up, basically. And in some way, that's really what we're doing with the work on technology. So one, which was unexpected, is work on COVID. That we planned for that one, but we're doing some work on that too. And I would say actually a lot of it as part of our work on digitalization, just because well, when everyone had suddenly to go to remote education, then people realized that technology is more important than what they had actually perhaps assumed before. And for us, it was really a great way to see where countries were at in terms of digital infrastructure, what they could do. Because we work as part of our work. We work currently on the use of AI, learning analytics, blockchain, robots, etc. And then you have the COVID, and you realize that in fact most of the responses do not rely on these rather advanced technologies, but it's more setting up a website, a platform of resources, or on Zooming, using mobile phones, sometimes even actually old technologies such as TV or radio, and so that many people would be surprised to know that suddenly that was the returns of TV education. That's but I must say in innovative ways. So it's not like it's usually criticized for being a one-way medium, but during the COVID, people have really managed to invent more engaging ways of using this media, and so that's perhaps an interesting thing for the future as well. People in education are a bit more conservative than the general population. I would say, not because I'm more conservative individually, it's more that there is this idea that it's more dangerous because we have children involved, basically, and it's also the culture of the sector as a whole, because it's a public sector, and it wants to be much more insulated towards a private interest than many others. Also in terms of value, I guess, so that so it's, for example, very different from the health sector. But I think what has changed a lot during that time is that probably there might be less reluctance when we get out of the crisis, just because, in fact, the need to have something which works will become more important. And so now, interestingly, I would say there is a stronger emphasis on the question of the digital competence of teachers and students, and I don't know how it's going to change, and even on the availability of tools, and how we deal with that, especially if we want to consider that it may continue for a while, or that we have to be ready for another or other similar events which may require that people work more remotely. Then actually challenges the very idea of free education in many countries. So if in fact to do your schooling, you need to have an internet connection at home, plus devices. And so it is very interesting that it just reintroduces some questions that were, assumed as non-relevant, because in fact, if your model is that you go to school, and that you do most of your schoolwork in school, then you don't need to have all these requirements, basically. So that changes. I think that changes a bit. But of course, the question on what can we trust, how to regulate, interact with the private sector, with the EdTech, is one of the big questions. Actually, that's one of the two main topics that we're going to deal with as part of the current phase of the project. We're going to start with some work on the digital infrastructure of countries for education. And the other aspect is really about the governance of digitalization in some way. So both how you general level things like I would say, transparency, ethics or whatever, which actually works for both public and private. And then the more specific aspects of how to deal with the private sector and how to, and with two different aspects. One is how you manage to get the private sector to develop good and relevant solutions for education. And invest enough to do something which is really educational on the one hand. And on the other one is also, how you kind of regulate and make sure that in terms of procurement, that you get good products, that you get useful things, that how you deal with the data that the companies are going to have, because actually they work in public schools, it's and so the big strength of a place like the OECD is that you have access to, in principle, at least 37 countries. And so you can actually compare a lot of different practices, a lot of different ways of dealing with those things. Yeah, so, I mean, there are a few things that are exciting in different ways. I would say that I find blockchain exciting as a solution for credentialing, mainly because it's something which is kind of technically ready, so that's it's technology that does what it says it does, so it's very limited in scope. But it's an exciting, and here, one of the big difficulties in that area is more to create the institutional and legal infrastructure for it to be taken up, and the incentives for that, that's, but it's something that, in my view, is coming, will be coming relatively soon. One which is much more coming up, at a much longer term is all the things around classroom analytics, so things to actually give feedback to teachers in the classroom or after class, but trying to analyze, capture, support teachers about what they're doing in class with a group. And that is perhaps because that's one of the things that I didn't know much about before we started our work. I think that's one of the things that I find really exciting in what is coming, in terms of now the reality. I have the impression, of EdTech is that a lot of it is happening outside the formal school sector. That's perhaps, for the reasons that you've mentioned before, that there is more of a market, lifelong learning outside of school, and that's really where the industry seems to put a little bit more effort, than actually trying to develop solutions for the school sector. It's one thing to have sometimes good processes, to have even a good infrastructure, but it's a very different thing to have it used by actual stakeholders and not to mention having it used by effectively, so that's part of the, but of course, if you need to have both, so that if you have nothing, then there is nothing to be used. But as we know, that was a big critique of education technology since the beginning, that it's all these metaphors or these examples of computers in their boxes in some school corridor. So that's actually what people always say about when you talk about technology. Many people make the wrong assumption that just because you have the tool, you will use it, or you will know what to do with it. And some actually, the reason why if you don't use it is because you have the things that go with it, So I remember I did a few years back a review of a digital strategy in Italy, where the plan was to roll out an interactive whiteboard plan.
Yeah.
Which was great, and so there was a lot of things, but frankly, it was very clever policy. One limitation of it, was there were several limitations, but one of it was that there was a kind of assumption that the teachers would develop the resources going with interactive whiteboards. The teachers don't have time to do that. Or the will or whatever, or the competence sometimes, but and so if you don't think of how actually you're going to make the life of your teachers easy by giving them resources that they can use, showing them how so a lot of the training, people say, oh, you need training, but in fact you don't need training in using the whiteboard, so that you can figure out yourself. What you need as a training is really how you do your class, using it in a different way. What are the things that you can do? What is it good for? What it's useless for? When a distraction? When is it something that actually makes sense? And so, yeah, that's really part of the. And at the same time, when everyone's always says we need more digital competencies, more training, etc., and I always feel at the same time that no one ever gave me a training to use my phone, so that it's also a question of how can suppliers do things that actually are user-friendly and relevant, to what teachers do in a classroom, basically. We're in some ways very obsessed by how much time our children spend on their screens, basically. That's always technology, just because, perhaps because, we believe it's addictive, or we're not sure what they're doing, or because we feel that we should be doing something else. And so there is actually this social challenge of that the older generation, so the parents of today and the grandparents, they don't really have this type of technology in their schooling life or education life. And so that now to them, it is a bit weird to have, to imagine. And so they tend to feel, because unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, but education is a bit of a special sector for that, because everyone has an opinion about what it should be. People don't mind that you have a lot of technology in a hospital. They would never say that you should do things the same way as what were done 30 years ago, because so they're happy to have technology there. In education, they're a bit more reluctant, and I suppose it's it's because they have their own idea of what education should be. Also, partly because they are strong actors of education themselves. More than the schools, I would say. In some cases, not of the academic education of the children, but of their education or upbringing.